They told me hope would be enough. They lied. A mother returned from the edge of death to expose the proud men plotting peace as a mask for conquest today.
My name is Mira Ivanov. I am 32, and on an ordinary July evening in 2025, I folded my little girl's sunflower shirt when my heart gave out. That small home in Ohio, lent to us by strangers who became my safety net, felt like the last fragile island of normalcy. Before the war, I sketched buildings for a living back in Kherson. Lines, light, and the math of beauty were my companions. Now I folded towels for a living, each pass of the fabric a quiet prayer for my husband Dmitry and for the life that was swallowed by the noise of tanks and sirens. I thought I had enough breath left for the refugee life, gratitude, steady labor, and the small joy of Anya's laughter ringing through a room painted like a field of yellow blooms. But that evening, the breath left me. I remember the pain like a blade, sudden, hot, and cruelly efficient. One breath, then another that never came. In the room where the dryer hummed, I fell and watched my world tilt. Only later would the doctors measure 23 silent minutes. Yet in that stretch, everything changed. I hovered above myself, removed as if seeing a photograph, and there was a deep, peculiar calm I could not have invented. I saw the hands of my foster mother, Claire Harper, trembling as she clawed at my chest, and I saw Anya's small face, pressed to a doorway, eyes empty with a child's terrible understanding. From that ragged distance, I felt no panic, only a widening warmth that rose like dawn. Light gathered where the laundry closet had been, not harsh but tender, pouring like honey over every fear I had hoarded. I floated toward it, and the room unstitched itself from the world I knew. There was no ceiling, no floor. There was an absence of weight, and in that absence a presence stood. He was not a portrait I recognized. He was a presence that made description feel petty. He radiated without glare, and when he looked at me, the ledger of my life unfurled. Every exhausted prayer, every small kindness, every selfish omission, and I stood naked before what felt like absolute mercy. He did not speak with air. His words slid into me like truth. "Child, rest," he seemed to say, and my defenses fell like brittle doors. Shame unlatched itself. The anger I had nursed toward the men who ruined our streets softened beneath an inexplicable compassion. I wept, not from fear but from relief that my smallness had been noticed and my sorrow had not been wasted. Images assembled. Dmitry huddled in a muddy trench, clinging to a photograph of our family, Anya learning to sleep with a sun-painted blanket, refugees learning to call strangers family. I felt the pulse of a greater story. Then the scene shifted and the warmth thinned into a stage where two great men sat across a heavy table bright with polished wood and veiled curtains. I could sense the names before the faces registered. A commanding leader of the East and a showman of the West, each clasping power like a talisman. In one corner, I saw not only a man, but an arrogance that behaved like a living thing, pride given teeth and agency. It fed him pictures of empire and whispered that history awaited his hand. Across from him sat a different storm, not a single sharp shadow, but a swarm of flattering murmurs, the fever of public praise and legacy-making. He was told he could be the architect of peace, the peacemaker who stitched medals and monuments to his name. In that room, they spoke of armistices and applause, of photographs and signatures, yet none of those instruments touched the real currents that moved nations. The dark thing at the first leader's shoulder told him to use a pause as a weapon, to let others celebrate a fragile peace while he gathered strength like a coiled thing. The being's whisper smelled of history turned to hunger. I saw how easily men could be cloaked by whispering spirits, voices that are neither ancient nor visible, but are every bit as persuasive as doctrine. One demanded glory, another whispered flattery and deals. They turned diplomatic hands into instruments of a far older game. I recoiled at the cold cleverness of it, at how a promised ceasefire could be a snare, not a resolution. Beyond those halls, the presence showed me another feeder, the thin, bright chords of prayer rising from millions of ordinary places. Kitchens where women whispered names into folded palms, dorm rooms where students paused between homework and sleep, dim churches where elder women bent knees like old trees. At first, those threads looked fragile. Each one was a trembling candle in a gale. Then they braided together into a rope of light so strong that it bent the will of fate. I watched a missile guided toward a hospital with children and saw its course stutter and fail as a wave of petitions hit the unseen guard. The missile detonated harmlessly in a field. The hospital stood. Those who prayed afterward had no idea what hands they had aided, and that was the point. Prayer is often anonymous valor. When I turned back to the figure who held all these vistas, I felt both forgiven and burdened. You must go back, the presence communicated. Not with dread, but with clarity. Your body has a role. Your voice will stitch truth into tired souls. It was a sentence that sank into my marrow. The thought of leaving the warmth of that place after tasting such untroubled union was a wound, but a purpose clotted the ache. I agreed. I would return. I would tell of the shadows and the threads of light. I jolted back into my body with a violence that felt like being thrown through winter air. The hospital lights were sterile and sharp. A stranger's gloved hands pressed to my ribs. The beep of machines stitched a new rhythm into the room. Claire Harper's face was a ruin of relief. She clung to a hand I could not yet move. A doctor later would tell me with a mixture of scientific awe and confusion that my brain had shown no permanent damage despite the long silence. My pulse had gone still for 23 minutes, and by every technical measure, my presence here should have been impossible. All the same, breath returned as if by a covenant. I could not explain the quiet certainty that had settled inside me, nor the vision of the dark whisper and the tangled chorus behind another man's smile. Medical men called it a miracle. I called it a commission. As I recovered slowly, the images from that other room clung to me. I watched news footage of leaders hugging and signing, and I felt a coldness because what gleamed on the cameras was not always what guided the world. The trappings of diplomacy, press conferences, handshakes, the carefully staged halts, are only the skin. The marrow lies underneath where petty gods murmur. I began to travel in small, awkward ways. Community kitchens, churches, refugee meetings. My words were rough at first. The memory of the light felt private and holy, and sharing it felt like spilling a secret balm. But each time I described the vision, the same thing happened. Eyes widened, hands gripped, and a hush would fall. People did not want a politics lesson. They wanted to know what to do. I told them the only thing the presence had impressed on me. Pray, not mindless repetition, but focused, believing intercession that names harms, names hearts, and names leaders. Slowly, I began to see the pattern the presence had shown me. In moments when ordinary people prayed, women in a small church in Oklahoma, students in a dorm in Brazil, a volunteer in eastern Poland stuffing aid into boxes, threads of light rose like a harvest. Those threads pooled at a place I could not name, and they became armor. I told the story of the missile that misfired, of the unseen hand that diverted calamity, and no one could verify the truth of that claim. That did not matter. The point was not evidence, but engagement. The world changes where people commit their attention to mercy. The war had layers, troop deployments and negotiation rooms, and the spiritual currents that ride beneath them. The enemy exploited pride, whispering to kings and generals. It fed vanity and told men they were gods. I learned to frame the conflict for those who came to hear. This was not simply a clash of armies, but a struggle over the hearts that steer nations. When men imagine themselves as destiny's authors, they become susceptible to ruinous counsel. When they bow to flattery, the path to catastrophe widens. Yet I refused to leave the story in despair. The presence had shown me angels, battered and glorious, standing like a phalanx above my homeland. Their strength came from the smallest acts of faith. The paradox was a comfort. While men in palaces scheme, salvation often grows in quiet rooms. I pressed this into every speech, every conversation, because I believed in a grassroots kind of warfare, petitions lifted by hand and by heart. People asked what they should pray. I told them, pray for wisdom for leaders. Pray that pride would crack and reveal humility. Pray for clarity so that deceit cannot steer policy.
Pray for the safety of innocents. Pray for those who foment hate to be disarmed by compassion. I urged intercessors to be precise, to petition not only for victory, but for conversion, asking God to soften consciences so that decisions would not be made by ambition, but by mercy. The response surprised me. Small pockets of prayer rose. A congregation in Kansas kept a nights-long vigil. A university group scheduled weekly calls. A grandmother in Ukraine lit candles and whispered names into the dark. The threads accumulated, and I began to sense their effect. Fewer strikes in some regions, more aid reaching cornered communities, commanders hesitating where they had previously been ruthless. These patterns could be coincidence, but my faith is not satisfied with cynicism. It demands action and witness. He stood with tears and promised to pray. That promise felt like a shield. I continued to travel, to speak, and to remind weary hearts that steadfast prayer is a defense no army can buy. Recovery stitches itself slow and stubborn. Physically, I mended. Emotionally, I rebuilt in a different currency, one made of conversations and small mercies rather than blueprints and deadlines. In time, a letter arrived from Dmitri, written on torn paper, each sentence rubbed raw with the mud and cold of the front. He described unlikely kindnesses from strangers in foxholes, a shared crust of bread, the way a photograph of Anya kept his hand steady. He wrote of a quiet moment when comrades paused and whispered a name. In that pause, a decision to spare a convoy was made. That letter felt like proof enough.
I began to travel back across borders in ways that were permitted, through small gatherings of refugees, through aid conferences, through conversations with local leaders willing to listen. I told my story not as doctrine, but as testimony, an invitation to join a battlefield that asks no uniform. Sometimes I watched delegates announce ceasefires and treaties and felt the old sting of skepticism. But I had also seen the soft interior, where prayer and policy met. When prayers increased in number and focus, logistics occasionally opened. When attention wavered, doors closed again. The pattern was not scientific proof, it was a tapestry of experience. One evening in a crowded makeshift shelter, I watched a mother clutch a charred doll while she whispered names into the night. Her rhythm of petition was methodical as a carpenter's stroke, and I realized that prayer, repeated with devotion, accumulates like mortar. That night, the conversation in the shelter turned from doom to small, actionable hope. Whether to send rice north, whether to schedule medical runs, whether to keep a watch on a supply line. Practical steps, yes, but threaded through with the expectation that someone beyond sight listened. Not everyone accepted the message. I was scorned by pundits who said spiritualizing geopolitics was reckless. I was loved by mothers who had nowhere else to plant their grief. I learned to speak to both, to trade barbs with cynics not with anger, but with the data of the heart. Stories of rescues that arrived at odd hours, reports of commanders refusing orders, inexplicable pauses in assaults. Those are not proof in a court of law, but they are the proof that matters to people who go to bed praying for a child. The war behind the war is not theater. It is real, painful, and intimate. Pride preens in palaces and falsehoods curl into policy rooms. But the path forward that I kept returning to was humble and domestic. To teach people how to pray with focus and love. To beg for the softening of hardened hearts. To intercede for the rulers as well as the ruled. If you only pray for victory, you risk perpetuating cycles of revenge. If you pray for conversion and mercy, you invite an outcome that breaks cycles and births something new. If you wonder how to start, find a corner, name specific needs, petition for mercy for both victim and aggressor, and enlist others to hold the same request. Small, steady circles of intercession become networks of protection in ways we cannot always map. This is urgent work. If this story reached your heart, join us in the quiet fight. Subscribe, share, and pray with intentionality. Name the places, name the leaders, plead for mercy. Every sincere petition is a thread, Together we weave a shield for the vulnerable and a softening for the proud. Don't let politics numb your compassion. Keep watching, keep praying, and bring others into the circle. If you pledge to pray with focus and to return with action, subscribe now and follow our channel for more testimonies, encouragement, and ways to stand for peace in practical, powerful ways. Stand firm in hope today. Always.